every day you and I get bombarded with negative news. Just like the body becomes what we eat, the mind becomes what we're putting in. It is important to listen to stories that not only gives you hope, but also inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we're interviewing experts who will break down the solutions to the world's most pressing problems. And I promise you, if you listen to this podcast, you will not only stay informed, but you will also feel more energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Great.com is a philanthropic project where we're donating 100% of the profit towards the most effective cause areas. Right now, we're focusing on the climate change, like funding climate change technology and protecting the rainforest. The best thing that you can do if you want to help our mission is to subscribe to this channel. The topic of today is Hydrocephalus. What is that, and what is important to know when it comes to hydrocephalus? And to understand more about this, we invited Diana Gray, who's the president and CEO of Hydrocephalus Association. So I want to say, Diana, welcome to this interview.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you, Spirit.
The same. Help us to understand, what would you say, if people have never heard about hydrocephalus, what is that?
Yeah, well, hydrocephalus is a neurological condition in which you have an overaccumulation of cerebrospinal fluid. So water on the brain is literally what hydrocephalus means. So you have an overaccumulation of cerebrospinal fluid in your brain, and it causes the ventricles in the brain to enlarge. It's one of the reasons that babies' heads are measured when it is the reason that babies' heads are measured at birth. And so that fluid cannot drain because there's a blockage. It could be caused by an infection that's causing scarring and a blockage, or a hemorrhage that happens at birth. And that fluid, cerebrospinal fluid that normally would flow through the body, cannot properly drain. And so it requires brain surgery to treat the condition, often through a shunt, which is a valve with a tube that's either placed on the top of the head or the back of the head. They drill a hole in the head and place the shunt, and then the tubing goes through the body. And often the tubing, which you can see on my pen right here, is actual shunt tubing, drains into the abdomen. Sometimes it's in the space around the heart or the lungs, but most often it's in the abdomen space. So that's with someone who has hydrocephalus. That's one of the ways that it's treated. It's the only treatment is brain surgery, sadly. There's another type of more natural shunting that is not used as often, called an ETV, or endoscopic third ventriculostomy, which is where they take an endoscope and burn a hole in the third ventricle of the brain, which allows the fluid to flow as well. It doesn't always work, but when it can work, it's great because you don't have this device in your head. And so why do I say you don't have this device in your head, and that's a problem? So for 50% of the pediatric patients who get a shunt, it will fail within the first 2 years, which means they have to have yet another brain surgery. And so it can fail because the shunt becomes occluded and it doesn't work anymore. And so all those symptoms come back, headaches, high pressure, and it's just not working. Or it could be an infection with the device that's causing a problem. So we have I know patients who have had more than 100 brain surgeries. And so that takes a toll on someone with hydrocephalus. The other important point to make, because I've talked a little bit about babies, and 1 in 770 babies in the United States will develop hydrocephalus in their first year. And that's more common than spina bifida or brain tumors, about as common as Down syndrome. But the other thing we often say is anyone at any time can get hydrocephalus. So you can get it from an injury. Someone can hit you in the head with a baseball and cause a brain injury. Veterans or folks in the military can have a brain injury and it can cause hydrocephalus. And then there's this other form of hydrocephalus that is very misunderstood called normal pressure hydrocephalus. And it can happen in the elderly. And it can cause dementia. It can cause problems with gait or walking and incontinence. And oftentimes that is misdiagnosed as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. And it's actually a treatable form of dementia. So we really want to get awareness out because oftentimes folks are misdiagnosed. And once they get the treatment, they can actually feel better and recover some of their loss of memory and recover some of their gait challenges and be able to walk again. And so it's challenging to get that message out.
Diana, let me take some time to summarize here. You're painting quite a dramatic picture. You're saying that it seems like the only way to deal with this is some kind of brain surgery or burning a hole inside of the brain or kind of putting a tube to drain the water. And I imagine that must be quite scary. And you're saying that 1 out of 700 babies get this, which would make it quite common.
Yes, we believe there are 1 million people in the United States who have hydrocephalus. So that includes from babies to these elderly individuals that have hydrocephalus. We don't really know how many people in the world have it. It's not one of those reportable conditions, so it's really hard to understand. We have some data that we can extrapolate, but we know there are millions of people in the world, and it's really challenging for underdeveloped parts of the world where someone doesn't have access to a hospital or a neurosurgeon. And so that makes the condition fatal because you do have to have, eventually the pressure builds up and you do have to have this shunting, whether it's natural through that boring a hole surgery where I talked about, or a shunt to drain that fluid through your body so that you can live a somewhat normal life. The other aspect of this is even after you have the treatment, which is great that there is a surgical treatment because before the 50s, there wasn't even a surgical treatment to help people with hydrocephalus. But you will see people that will have comorbid conditions like cerebral palsy, spina bifida, epilepsy, where they'll have seizures. And even our most high functioning patients that, let's say, have only had 1 or 2 surgeries and they're doing well, they're working, they've gotten that college degree, and so they haven't had a lot of learning challenges, although some do. Often you'll hear that they have something called executive function challenges or challenges with directions. And so Waze has been a great invention for people who need to drive and directions, because even places they're used to going, sometimes they forget how to get home. Even in high functioning individuals with hydrocephalus. And so there are sometimes learning challenges and intellectual challenges, even once the procedure can happen. But it's something we're working really hard to change. Our mission, the reason we exist, is to not only provide support and education for people who have the condition, but we also want to try to find a cure. And if not a cure, along the path of searching for a cure, we want to find better treatments for hydrocephalus. So I don't know if this is a good time to talk about it, but we are actively engaged in research that we have a lot of hope around.
Yes, I would like to go into the research that you're doing. Let me just, I imagine that I never heard about the term before we contacted you guys. And so I guess because there's a lack of awareness, and you said poorer countries wouldn't even know that this is what they're treating. I guess it would be also a challenge to get funding for this topic. So help us understand, is there a misunderstanding on how much funding that is being provided? And what would your association do if you would get funding for this? What is the research that you're doing?
Yes, of course. I think for any condition or disease, health problem in which it's not as common as a heart disease condition or diabetes or cancer, and all of those are critically important conditions and they need funding. But I think when you have a condition that doesn't impact as many people, awareness creates a challenge with funding. We really work hard to create awareness so that people will understand that funding can help us serve more people, and increased funding. If we were to get millions and millions of dollars, for example, we would invest that in more research. Before we launched our research program in 2009, and we've been around since 1983, mostly, started by parents who were passionate about, creating support for others and creating education and awareness. But at some point, once you have the treatment, you want to change the outcome of this, excuse me, for others who have hydrocephalus. And so you want hope that this can change. We want to change the future. And so there was a dearth of research in the hydrocephalus space. And so we started investing in research. And one of the gaps that we fill, especially in the United States, is in order to apply for National Institute of Health funds or any kind of federal funding, you have to already have data that what you are doing can make a difference to apply. And so scientists need funding to create that data. And so we have created one of our most successful programs are our Innovator Awards, and we encourage young scientists because we want to build the ecosystem of scientists who want to do research in this area, because a lot of scientists who've been around for years already have their path of where they're doing research. So we want to encourage new scientists to get into this field by funding their research. So we help them with these Innovator Awards to take a great idea they have, whether it's about the etiology of hydrocephalus or about how to do a different surgical procedure, or it could even be some different type of behavioral analysis around hydrocephalus, which we would be interested in as well. But mostly it's basic science that would get us to a different place in terms of treating hydrocephalus by understanding it. So once we fund them, and we have funded 43 projects through scientists in our now 11th year of doing this type of, actually 12th year, we've just started of doing research. They then can take their project and submit to the Department of Defense in the United States, funds some research, and then also the National Institutes of Health. And we've been fortunate because out of the $12 million that we've invested in this short amount of time, these scientists that we funded have gone on to receive $35 million in larger grants. So our message would be invest in us because we're seeing a pretty tremendous return on investment. But they need us to get that preliminary data. And we don't only fund basic scientists. We have 2 clinical research networks that we fund, one that's very focused on adults who have hydrocephalus and also that normal pressure, that elderly population, and then one that is really specifically focused on pediatric hydrocephalus and learning more about infection. And in fact, this clinical network, the Hydrocephalus Clinical Research Network, through their work in doing studies, has found a way to reduce infections by over 30%. So it's, the clinical research is important, as is the basic science as well.
So thanks to the funding that you provided to these researchers, because of the research that they've found, they were awarded with more money to continue the research. So it is important for the initial funding to be, yeah.
Exactly.
I was going to ask you. It flew by.
That's all right.
That's all right, right? Right. Now I remember. You said in the beginning that it is like it's going to end up in brain surgery, basically, if you do get this. So I guess one other research would be just to find a cure, but also to find less threatening treatments. Is that what you're talking about? That right now there are not so many options if you get this.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of the things we're very proud of is that in those Innovator Awards that we funded, some of those scientists are looking at improving treatments. So we have 10 projects right now where they're looking at drug therapies. They're not ready to, they're in animal models right now, but imagine if you could create a drug, and we have scientists working on a drug that could decrease CSF flow. So you could actually control the flow of CSF in the brain. That would be incredible. Or the number one cause of pediatric hydrocephalus is intraventricular hemorrhage. So a brain bleed is another way to say it. And we have scientists that are working on a way to, after the brain bleed, they inject drugs into these animals that then can prevent hydrocephalus after the brain bleed. So if we could do that in humans, then we're looking at a whole different treatment plan. But until we have the research farther along and those drug therapies are successful, the only option is to do some type of shunting where you can drain that fluid from the brain so that people can relieve that pressure that's in their brain. Another form of research, though, that I should talk about, though, because I mentioned that, sometimes the shunts occlude, they get blocked up. We do have scientists looking at how can we make better, is there a drug therapy that could potentially go within that tubing or within that shunt to keep it from occluding or getting blocked up. Even that on the short term could make a big difference in the lives of people with hydrocephalus if they just didn't have to go in for more surgeries.
I want to line back to also something that you said in the beginning about, so there's fluid coming out in the central of the brain, and this fluid becomes more and more fluid, which kind of adds pressure from the inside towards the other organs of the brain. Have I understood the phenomenon?
Yes, if you can't drain that fluid because you continue to make CSF fluid, then it does create pressure on the brain because your ventricles load up with that fluid and it really creates pressure on the brain and it becomes unsustainable until you can drain that pressure. So it can cause some really severe problems if brain surgery does not occur, if that shunting does not occur to alleviate that pressure. And again, in the case of the elderly, they definitely have the enlarged ventricles and the fluid, but they don't seem to have the pressure, and we don't know why. But or in some cases with normal pressure hydrocephalus, we don't know that it's related to an injury. We're not sure exactly why, but we know that it can be treated with this shunt surgery and alleviate those symptoms of dementia and the gait challenges and the incontinence, unless they have a comorbid condition or another condition that's also causing some of those symptoms. And that can happen too as people age.
We're going towards the end here in this interview, and you also kind of paint a picture on that it must be quite hard to get this information that either your child has gotten hydrocephalus or yourself, and that you could get it actually in any stage of life. It's not just infants and babies. So is there anything that you want to tell parents to a child who got hydrocephalus, or if you would say something towards someone who just found out? Anything important for people to understand when it?
Absolutely. I think what I would most say is to find a connection with others who've lived your experience. We talk a lot now about lived experience, and we try to provide that. There's hope. There's hope in the research that we're doing, absolutely. But once you're treated, and oftentimes if it's a parent who's, finding out it's their baby or their child, they're finding it out because their child has a surgery, right? And then they want to know, how do we live with this? And so one of the things we provide is information. A lot of information about some of the challenges and helping them deal with school and missing school, and how to cope with some of those intellectual challenges that can come along with it, and the learning challenges. And we also have a program to connect people with a peer support volunteer. And we have something called community networks. You don't call them support groups anymore, right? Because that has a stigma. Yeah, I don't need a support group. But just the ability to learn more and be in a community who understands what you're going through can be very validating, because sometimes you feel alone. If you don't know anyone else who has hydrocephalus. And we don't want people to feel alone. We can also help people find physicians if they're trying to get help. I mean, one of the other challenges that happens here is a child grows up and they can no longer see their pediatric care providers, and they need to find an adult provider. And sometimes in this country, it's hard for them to find a provider that wants to take care of hydrocephalus. And so we help with that as well. So we're there for support, but we're also there to provide hope through our research program. And we advocate. We do a lot of advocacy to make sure those research dollars are there on the federal level.
I'm going to give you the opportunity to kind of just summarize any kind of message that you want to leave us with today. What would you want to end this with?
I think what I would say is I'm hoping that those that are listening have learned something important about hydrocephalus, and that if you know someone who has the condition, please connect them to the Hydrocephalus Association. We do have people all over the world who connect to our resources on our website. It's Hydroasoc, and I'm sure you can put the website up, .org, to have access to our resources. And if you want to support us, you can do that through the same website, because we do have a great return on our investment. And the research is really the only thing long-term that's going to change the future for people with hydrocephalus. And that's very much what we want to do, is to create a different future than what we have now.
Beautiful. Hydroasoc.org is the website. You will find it here in the article as well. Diana, thank you very much for taking time to kind of just help us get the basics, but it also felt like, at least myself, got quite, I understood the journey people go through with this, and the research, the future for this. So very insightful information.
It was a pleasure to talk with you, Spirit, and thank you for giving us an opportunity to talk about this and create more awareness.